Welcome to this week's episode with the talented Karen Boss of Charlesbridge Publishing, who's going to discuss how to make characters stand out and feel real. I've admired Karen for many years and have heard her talk a few times at conferences, and I have been very impressed with her grasp of all things publishing. So thank you so much for being on Wayward Writers today, Karen.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. It's so nice to see you all and to join you to record an episode of this.
So happy to have you here. Yes, absolutely.
Nikki, will you tell us more about Karen?
I would be
please?
honored. As Heather said, Karen Boss is an editor at Charlesbridge. She holds an MA in children's literature from Simmons University and is a mentor in their MFA program. Karen also has an MA in higher education administration and worked at colleges and in the nonprofit sector for 15 years. She edits fiction and nonfiction picture books, middle grade and YA. In her free time, Karen saves her pennies so she can travel to a new country each year, and she often plans Auntie Karen adventures for her 4 nieces. Ooh, so fun.
Does sound fun.
Yeah.
So you're not only an auntie, you're a traveler too. So tell us more about your travels and your auntie adventures.
Yeah, sure. So I actually had never traveled anywhere until I was in my late 20s. And then I put a backpack on and I saved as much money as I could. And I went traveling for a year.
Oh, cool.
And that turned into 26 months actually of being away. And then I ended up living on a small island in Thailand for a little while. So long story short is when I left there to come home, I just made a promise that I would try to travel every year. And I have been mostly successful. The pandemic made it a little difficult. But this year, I'm actually going to Bologna to the Children's Book Fair for the first time. I manage our foreign import program. So I'm going to go this year and I tacked on some extra time. So I'm going to spend some time in Venice this year.
I love Venice.
Yeah.
I've been there before. You're going to adore it. Get lost there. Have so much fun.
Yeah.
Karen, I've heard that you love unusual characters. Can you tell us about some of the unusual characters in the books that you've acquired?
Yeah, sure. So it's funny that the word unusual is so interesting to me, right? Because I feel like every person in the world could be called unusual in some way, right? And so every character could too, I think. But what I really love is deep and thoughtful characters, flawed characters. I'm a big fan of the media that I intake. Those are my favorite characters, are flawed characters, and emotional characters who really pull you in and make you feel their emotions alongside them. And so one example that I want to mention is I have this book coming out in May and it's called The Kid. It's a middle grade novel and it's by Jeff Schill. He's a debut. And it's actually a Charlesbridge Moves book. This is our new imprint. These are middle grade books that are aimed at reluctant readers and especially boys, but not exclusively boys. And in that book, there are 3 main characters. There's Henry, who's 14 years old. He's trying to hold his family together, trying to hold his brothers together. There's Herbert, who's an adult, who's an editor, and he is trying to figure out why these stories have stopped being sent to him for his Western magazines. This takes place back in the 1880s. And then there's Snake Eyes Sam, who's this outlaw, and he fancies himself the baddest outlaw in the West. And the 3 of them, it's 3 different viewpoints that are happening in the book. And all 3 of these characters are endearing in their own ways and also really flawed and really trying to figure out themselves alongside the reader trying to figure out what they want. And for me, that's just the most intriguing thing about characters is for a reader to be like, as I follow this, what is this character trying to do? And are they going to get it? Right. And I just love that. And then I have this other book that's coming out in March called La Mala Suerte is Following Me. And it's by Anna Sequeira and it's illustrated by Carlos Velez Aguilera. And in that one, it's a little boy whose grandma basically says, you opened an umbrella in the house and now you have bad luck.
Oh, no.
And La Mala Suerte, Mrs. Bad Luck is going to follow you.
I love
and
that.
He's so earnest, right? This kid is, Mrs. Bad Luck is ruining my life. He's the reason I failed my exam. She's the reason that I'm not as good of a goalie as I usually am. And the earnestness in him just won me over right away. And there's not really anything too unusual about him. He's every kid. But at the same time, that earnestness, like, super intrigues me. The other thing too is I edited a lot of nonfiction. And for me, the characters in nonfiction books are just as important, right? Whether it's the book is about whales and the main character is whales, right? And then how are they portrayed and how do they pull me in? Or if it's a nonfiction story that somehow has some structural through line that almost becomes a character in and of its own. And then the other thing that intrigues me, and this is, I think, goes in the bucket of unusual characters, is when almost people that aren't people are characters. So settings maybe, or locations. Like there's this book that came out a while back that I edited called D39. It's a novel in verse by Irene Latham. And in that book, the landscape is almost a character. And if you were to read it that way, you could really dig into what makes this landscape tick and what makes it so important to the story. So I get pulled in by unusual ways of showing characters more than the actual character themselves, if that makes sense.
It's interesting.
Absolutely. What makes a character feel fully developed to you in a story?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about a lot is that I read picture book manuscripts and novel manuscripts where I feel like all the bones are there, like the skeleton is there and it's good, it's solid, there's a plot, but that there's meat missing. And whether that's development of the character or whether it's that there's lack of the everyday world of the character, that like every single thing you learn about the character is only related to one of the bones. And so they don't feel as full or as round as I want them to. They don't feel as fully human as I want them to. I want them to have relationships with other people. I read a lot of manuscripts where the main character feels, I always say, alone in the world, because whatever's happening in the plot really only concerns them. So you absolutely could write it where there's nobody else. But because most of these characters are kids, it seems unusual that they don't have a friend or a sibling or a dog or anybody else in their world, right? And I always want that. The other thing that really makes characters feel fully developed to me is their development during the story. What do they want? Do they get it or not? They don't have to get it, but what is it that they're trying? What's going on? And I think that goes back to tension in stories and the structure of the plot. But for me, without that, a character just never feels that fully developed to me, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So you gave us a couple of examples of some that you've worked on getting or receiving fully developed characters. Are there some other books that you've just enjoyed reading that have really well-developed characters that you could tell our listeners about in either middle grade or picture book?
Sure. One of my go-tos that I always mention is Penelope the T-Rex in We Don't Eat Our Classmates.
Yes, that's a great one.
That story is just, hilarious and funny. But I really feel like we get a really good understanding of what Penelope is struggling with. Let's just start with that she is so excited to start school and then discovers that her classroom is full of human children, and she wants to eat them. What a challenge, right? What a terrible challenge to give a character. And then she has to really try hard to not eat them because she wants to be their friend. And I just find her so well developed in that story. And at the end or actually throughout, where she talks to her parent about it, like what to do about this challenge she's having. The other two books, it's a book and a sequel, are Wolf Hollow and My Own Light by Lauren Wolk. Okay. And I just think Annabelle in those books, I feel like after reading those that I could walk right up to her farm, sit down next to her and totally know who she is. And to me, that is just success in a way that Lauren should just be so proud of. And I just love those books, partly for that reason, that Annabelle is so fully developed and so clear in who she is and what she wants and what she's trying to make happen. And then one of my own ones, this is a nonfiction book, is called Troublemakers in Trousers by Sarah Albee.
That's a great one.
And it was illustrated by Kaya Kashvez. And the way that Sarah weaves each one of those women's stories in so few words, but it really gets to the heart of what made them tick. And I think for me, they're real women, right? But when you write about them, they are the character in their chapter. And for me, from go, I was like, I can understand who these women were and why they're interesting and important. And I just think Sarah has a way with weaving that kind of story.
She's brilliant.
So, yeah.
Great book too. I love that.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned and have mentioned a couple of times, and that I see all the time in my query inbox, is that the characters don't solve their own problems. And I think that making the protagonist be proactive and also giving them that like deep-seated motivation, like you keep saying, what makes them tick, what makes them, like their own individual person. So in order to do this, authors often make parents dead, or the parents are missing, or the parents are alcoholics. Do you have any ideas of other ways to accomplish a character's independence? Or do you have any thoughts about that issue?
Yeah. This is such a great question because it does come up. I think that so many kids, particularly middle schoolers and high schoolers, are taking care of much of their own business. Like they lean on their parents, like even for the day to day, but they also have lives that are totally their own, that they really aren't inviting a whole lot of people into, or not inviting a whole lot of adults into. So one example, I'm working on a book now that's coming out early next year. It's called Werewolf Hamlet. Ooh. And the protagonist in that book is 10. And he's dealing with a lot of stuff. Like they're losing their house. The older brother is drinking. He's got pressure at school. And he's got 2 parents who love him through that entire book. The author is Kerry Madden Lunsford. And she really does this brilliant job of creating Angus's own world and his own thoughts and his own decisions that are really separate from his parents or from any kind of parenting. And I think it's a really brilliant example of how kids really are living their lives even with 2 parents in the house who are parenting them. I also think that in manuscripts and stories, friends, and I touched on this around, you don't want a kid to feel alone in the world, but friends are important. And so many manuscripts I read don't have any close relationship for the kid. Yeah. And some books, of course, are about kids that don't have any friends. And like, that's fine. But there are neighbors, there are kids at the bus stop, there are teachers, there's the lunch lady. There's just so many people in kids' lives who they see every day and they talk to. And I just think no kid is really totally alone in the world. And so they can't be alone in a manuscript, right? And so I don't think at all that parents have to be dead or missing or inept in order for them to have agency. Like, I get why we see it. It's definitely across media. We see it in Disney.
Oh, yeah. We know everyone, this. Karen.
I know.
It's hard because not everyone has that situation. I remember my boys coming to me and they would be like, but I have 2 parents and they like each other and they like me. Like, where are those books? And I'm like, they're out there. It's just sometimes that has a challenge that is immediate, and it is relatable. And of course they're needed. But yeah, Disney, those poor kids, man, those parents.
You do not, you don't want to be a parent in a Disney movie because you are not going to last.
You got laughing. Right.
It's very sad. Bambi.
Yeah. So I absolutely think that there is ways to keep the parents there. They can show up occasionally. They can help once in a while. But I think what we need to remember as adult writers, because this is always one of the disconnects, we are adults writing for kids. We're trying to understand kid life now, even though we really can't. Even when we're parents and we're watching it, there's still some hidden part of it, right? And I think we have to just remember that sometimes the easiest solution isn't the best one.
Totally fair. Yeah. Okay. So Karen, what if your character is unlikable in the beginning or they have a negative character arc? What are the ways to make them relatable and help the reader still want to stick with them and root for them throughout the book?
Yeah. So I love unlikable characters. Like, I just think anti-heroes are the best. Like, I'm a huge fan of Breaking Bad. I'm a huge fan of all these shows and other stuff where people, because for me, it's as an adult looking at it, it's like, what's the psychology of makes this what's so fascinating, right? But the thing is, there are a lot of angry, upset, and struggling kids in the world, and there's just no reason why they shouldn't be able to see themselves. Like, every character in every book should be likable and funny and smart and intrepid, and that just can't. It's not real life. And I also think a lot of books make the bully or the problem character unlikable. And that doesn't always work. Like, they're the only unlikable person. Like, everyone else is awesome. And it's like happy sunshine rainbows. And then you've got this one like mean kid who's just living in this bubble over here. And that feels really typical to me, and it doesn't always work. I also think there can be an unlikable parent, an unlikable sibling, and I think the central character can be unlikable too. I also think, what is unlikable? Like, to whom? We all have things that we like in other people for different reasons, and it's not always the same definition of what that means. There are as many kind of readers as there are characters, and if someone doesn't want to read your character because they either find them unlikable or they don't connect with them for some reason, that's okay, because there's probably as many readers who do as who might not. And I think it's true for genre. It's true for everything. What do people like to read? My mom has been in the same book club for 40 years, and they have a rule that they can't read anything that's too depressing. But like, everyone's definition is different.
Different
right?
triggers,
So,
different. Yes.
exactly. So they have a hard time picking a book because of that. And I think the same is true. I don't want to read this character who is like constantly complaining or constantly stressed. But then there's just as many people who might be like, oh my God, I feel really seen, because that's something that I feel. Yeah.
So it's more about how rounded the character is and the development track that they take. Okay. So what do you do about characters that aren't human, like nonfiction? What do you do with all of those?
So I haven't edited a lot of fictional books that have animal characters, but I think the most important thing for fiction is that they have to be fully developed. They're stand-ins for humans, right? They still have to be the fully developed. They still have to have emotions and such. And I don't love it. This goes back to killing off the parents to avoid something. I don't love when animals are used to avoid something like race or gender in a book. Like, oh, we'll just make them hippos in a lake, and then we don't have to deal with whatever the
topic
fill
is.
in the blank.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of nonfiction, for me, it's really, how is the thing portrayed or developed? And largely, I think it's through structure, right? So I have these poetry collections that I have there's 3 of them. The first one's called Now You See Them, Now You Don't, poems about creatures that hide. The second one is A Place to Start a Family, poems about creatures that build. And the third one that's coming is called Wild Brunch, poems about how animals eat. And so the thing is, like, you've got these 12 or 14 animals in each book. They all have something in common, right? So right there, that's a character trait that you're pulling through as a thread, right? And then it's like each poem explains something about that creature. And through the poem, you're learning about their habits, which then make them into a character that a kid might want to go learn more about. It sounds weird to use the word character in that kind of a case, but for me, that's what it feels like. That you still are connecting with the animal in the book as you're learning about how it is alive and how it lives its life.
Or even taking, for instance, the picture book about smoke and turning that into a character throughout, because it ties everything. So how do you advise writers to look at some of those things? It's done. And when it's done, it's so beautiful, but man, I do think it's what makes the story.
Yeah, just last night I was teaching a workshop about versus prose versus lyrical, and verses is not the right word in there, but it's like one of those. And I think one of the ways I see it done best for a character like that, like the smoke that you mentioned, or a landscape, or something like that, is through lyrical writing, right? I'm working on a book right now about the seed safe in Norway. If you don't know, and so the main character in that book is the seed safe, right? How was it built? How does it exist? Why does it exist? And that book, if it were written in regular straight up prose, I think it could be dry and boring, right? Written in this more lyrical way where it's like you're going into a hallway that's covered in ice, and you are getting down you have to open a door. And then once you get in there, there are all these seed packets and what's inside of them, right? And so it's this way of inviting a reader in through sort of the language you're using to make something that isn't human into something that can evoke emotion, right? Another example is Michelle Cusolito's book, Flying Deep.
I love that book too.
About Alvin, right? The deep sea submersible.
Yeah.
And she puts the kid in the driver's seat of Alvin. But it's really just, what is a dive in Alvin like, right? What do we do? But she includes things like, what music are you going to play? And what are we going to see when we're down deep? And so that stuff makes Alvin feel more like a fully developed character. Plus, you get to meet the stuff in the ocean that then pulls you in as well.
Oh my gosh, our listeners are going to have so many great books to read after this podcast if they haven't. I'm like thinking, I'm like, oh, Nick, we'll put them in the notes, everyone. Don't worry. They'll be in the notes.
And they are.
There you
and
go.
if you
Awesome.
haven't read, those are all so good. Those are great books.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love all of that. Thanks. Gives me a lot to think about.
So what methods do you recommend for authors to use when they're developing their character?
Okay, so the first one is I love off the page exercises to get to know your characters better. So write about the character from the point of view of another character in the book. So you ask a different character, hey, what do you know about this person? Or why do you like them? Or what makes you crazy about them? And then you write from the other character's point of view about your main character or the character you're trying to get to know better. And then what do you discover from that you didn't know before? Another one is very similar, but you write from the point of view of somebody who is in that character's life who is not in your book. So nowhere on your page is this kid's math teacher. But you sit down and write about this kid from their math teacher's point of view and figure out, what does the math teacher know that you haven't really thought about yet? Another one that I love is to write a letter from the character to their best friend who moved away recently. And what do you learn about your character in what they have to say to that person that they miss, that they're sad is gone, and that was their very best friend in the world. And then another one that I actually have never done in a workshop or assigned to anybody, but I really like the idea of it, is write an obituary for the character when they're old and gray.
Oh,
so like you've got a 12-year-old kid, write their obit when they're 78 and see what comes out in that, and then see what you might be able to integrate or give hints of in your character development that would lead to that obituary existing. The other couple of things is work on voice. How does your character sound when they talk? Is it unique to them or does it seem run of the mill? Do they sound different than the other characters? Because they should. Then write the stuff of life into the story, not just the plot points, but like what did they have for breakfast on their way out the door? So instead of just they grabbed their backpack and ran out the door, instead they grabbed their backpack and orange and their water bottle as they ran out the door. So now we just know more about this character. Or on the way home from the bus, instead of just she walked home from the bus despondent over what happened at school that day, she walked home from the bus and stopped and moved a caterpillar out of the road onto the grass. It's 5 words. But now I know more about who this kid is because she moved a caterpillar. And it's not related to the plot, right? It's just related to character development. And then the last thing, and this is big in picture books, is you got to give the kids some kind of agency. And there's a lot of people that hate that phrasing, but I just read too many picture book manuscripts where some adult is imparting all the information or all the wisdom. And I don't mean that the kid has to like be some super kid that like understands the world but it's let them ask some question or let them be the one at the end who's, oh, now I'm going to do this or whatever. Because I just think too many adults are solving the problems and saving the day in picture book manuscripts. Yeah.
Or something else just coincidentally happens and then suddenly the problem is fixed and for some reason it happens too.
Yeah. Those are definitely some of catch them. Are there some other don'ts that you have on characters or behaving a certain way that when you look at it, you're like, not going to work no matter what?
Yeah. I mean, if it's authentic, right, then it's fair game. So if a kid is acting in a way that feels really authentic, then you're good. I think if behaviors feel contrived, would a kid actually do that or say that? Or if there's no explanation for why they suddenly are behaving or there's no tether to anything in the story, that can be hard to believe. And to jump off what you were saying, Heather, that solutions often come too easy or too soon in a book. Like it's one of the main reasons that I decline a manuscript often is because things work out for a character or not, but it's often that everything is a problem and then suddenly everything's fine. And I'm just like, I think this is a pacing issue, possibly. It could be a tension issue, possibly. Or it could be that the writer just got themselves in a corner where they have 600 words or 650 words and they couldn't really figure out any better way. So they just went there. And I think it needs to be more organic and happen in a way where the pacing makes sense. Those are some more do's and don'ts at the same time.
I think one of the main reasons that I reject a lot of manuscripts is that a lot of times I read characters that sound not real, or they're stiff, or they're stilted, or like the voice just is not right. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like you can tell that this is a 70-year-old person writing what they think a toddler or a 5-year-old sounds like, and it's not really real. So do you have any advice for making characters sound natural and real?
Yeah. So I think one thing is that a lot of times people, and I get this in pitch letters a lot, is that people they're formulating some story based on a grandchild or on a kid, their own child. And so then that's one kid. Yeah. And it's not sort of an every kid. And not every character has to be every kid. That's not what I mean. But it can be difficult because people are like, this is what my grandchild sounds like. And so therefore, and then we're saying, this doesn't sound like what a 5-year-old would say, but they're my 5-year-old. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. And I'm sorry. That's the one thing. I think going somewhere where you can listen to kids talk and learning the organics of it, which can be very difficult, right? Like, where can you go observe kids? But if you do have a grandchild, then maybe you're the grandma that takes the kid to the birthday party that week, and you get to listen to 8 5-year-olds as they interact with each other or something like that. I also think that a lot of times when people go to paper, suddenly there's a formality that comes out of the typing or out of the pen. I want people to use contractions because that's how we talk. We don't say, I am going to the store. We say, I'm going to the store. I think really paying attention to how do people actually talk and then getting that onto the page. And not just kids. Like I see a lot of adult characters that feel even more stilted, right? Because, and often there's too much use of somebody's name. So it's, I don't know, Karen, what do you think? And I'm like, nobody says that. Instead, they would say, I don't know. What do you think? Right. Yep. And so I think one is that organics and how people actually talk. I think also, this really comes down to, I just did a workshop as well about voice versus tone and really figuring out like, what is your writing voice? Like, what is the thing that stays consistent in your writing? And then what's the tone of this actual piece, right? Because if this actual story is sad, then your characters might sound sad, but your actual writing voice is peppy in general. You could still have shorter sentences and this general peppiness in the feel of the manuscript, even though there's also this sadness that's happening. And it sounds like really weird that those two things could come together.
Sounds complicated. Mm-hmm.
It is very complicated. Yeah. Yes. But I think people lean in really hard to like what the topic is of the book, and they lose sight of some of this organic stuff. And I think and dialogue is really hard. It really is. When I read a middle grade book where the dialogue sounds really authentic right from go, I'm always just so impressed because it is very hard to do. Very hard.
Yeah, me too. Dialogue's so powerful. It's so challenging to write. At least I think it is. To get the voice right and for every character to sound different. If you weren't going to have any tags or any names, would you know who is speaking? So how can dialogue help in character development? Any advice?
Tell us how to.
What are the secrets?
Tell us how to fix all the dialogue problems. Okay.
There you go. Please. There you go. Okay. So I think one thing is that can hurt if there's too little dialogue. So I see a lot of manuscripts with no dialogue at all. So internal thoughts are okay, especially if you're in first person. But with so many manuscripts that I read, I leave a character feeling like they don't have any friends. We talked about this a little bit. Like they don't have any friends. They don't interact with anybody. Everything's introspective. And then there's not enough that makes their world feel real. And then on top of that, there's supposedly 8, but they're having these very philosophical thoughts, right? Which, yeah, and believe me, I think 8-year-olds have
Some
thoughts.
8-year-olds do.
But all in a row without ever talking to anybody else seems weird, right?
Yeah.
I also think too much dialogue can be really hard with character development. Like if there's not a setting or a plot, a lot of times it becomes talking heads. And sometimes it's one character goading another character, and then that other character is reacting. And that's all kind of funny and works well. But I always wish that there was more there to make the world feel whole and real, which then in turn helps with the character development, I think. We just talked about the unnatural dialogue, which can hurt, and natural dialogue can totally help. And then I think point of view really makes a big difference with dialogue and character development. So, for example, like I said, first person gets a ton of internal information about the character, but I think dialogue is still necessary to show how that character interacts with others. I particularly love when dialogue in a first person manuscript makes me get to know the character's name, because a lot of times I read these first person manuscripts and so much happens and I don't know the kid's name. And you don't have to, but it's like names are really important. They're really a big part of our identity, I think. And then third person, obviously the dialogue's important because otherwise we don't hear from the character. We only hear about the character. And I always want to hear from them so that I get to know what do they say when they speak and how often do they talk and what do they sound like and how does that make them a unique person. So I think for sure dialogue can hurt and help with development, but I think more, I would say that dialogue, the authenticity of dialogue is the most important thing for everything, is really figuring out what do kids sound like and what does your kid.
I think that what you show internally and then what they don't say often can have just as much impact on you learning about the character as what they do say. And so I think sometimes you should think just as much about what they're not saying as what they are saying, what they're hiding.
I agree. I do think people rely too on thoughts a lot, like basically dialogue, Karen thought. And I don't think that's bad. I think it has its place. But I think what you're saying is important, that sometimes we don't always need to know exactly what the person thinks in that moment. And I was saying in another workshop recently that there doesn't always need to be a full conversation either, even though it might happen in the real world. I use this funny example where Karen is going to buy butter and milk. So I go to the store, I'm a kid, I go to buy butter and milk. I get to the store where Mr. Jones owns the store and I know him. So I walk in and I say, "Hi, Mr. Jones, how are you today?" And in real life, Mr. Jones is probably saying, "I'm good. How are you? What are you here for?" And then I say, "I'm here to get butter and milk for my mom." And he's, "Oh, good. You're really good at buying things for your mom when she needs it." And we would have this whole conversation. But this does not need to be on the page, right? Number one, is Mr. Jones even important to the story? Maybe not, right? My guess is probably not. So you could absolutely be like, Karen went to the store to buy butter and milk. She walked in the door and greeted Mr. Jones. "How are you today, Karen?" Mr. Jones asked. Karen smiled as she went to grab the butter and milk. And then she approached the counter. "That's 42 cents, said Mr. Jones. And that's all you need, right? We don't need that whole conversation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But a lot of times I see that where it's just too many back and forths that just aren't doing anything to progress the story. Yeah.
So when you are talking to people about, you gave some great examples of exercises that you have for character development. What do you have them do for dialogue development?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of times that is something I say is homework, right? Go to the McDonald's that has a play space in it. You can't take notes. You can't record. You can't do anything. You are only listening for your own edification. Then go home and take some notes and think about what you heard. Like I said, take your kid or your grandkid to a birthday party and pay attention to what's going on. A lot of times when we do that as adults, we go in the kitchen with the other adults and we don't listen at all, but we can. I think the other thing is you could adapt any of those other character exercises that I mentioned, but instead write it all in dialogue. So write a conversation, like I just said, between Mr. Jones and Karen. Actually write the whole conversation between the character and the best friend that just moved away on the day that the friend was leaving. Write the whole thing. And your entire goal is to make sure that they sound different from each other, right? Because that then will help you as you're developing those characters who sound different from each other, because that can be really difficult, especially when you've got two kid characters that go to the same school, that live in the same state or the same town. And so those kids tend to sound alike. So then how do you still make them distinguished enough on the page to make it interesting?
I think one of the best books that has done this, that has always stuck in my mind, is Fatal Throne. It's a YA, and it's about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And every one, I mean, you wouldn't even have to know who the queen was. Everyone is so distinct, and it gives me goosebumps because it's so well done, and they all sound different. And
that is incredibly hard to do. Like, I don't want people listening to this to be like, oh, I'm having trouble, so that means that I'm doing something wrong, because you're not. This takes practice. It takes time. You need to be kind to yourself. You need to revise and try again. And I think putting things in a different point of view can help. If you are writing in third person and you are having a hard time developing your character, put the entire thing in first from that character's point of view and see what you can learn about them, and then go back to third, especially with a picture book. Or you could do that with one chapter of your novel. Pick it from the middle, right? Do one chapter. It might take a while, but it absolutely positively is worth it to jolt you out of whatever challenge you're having.
And critique partners and groups at some point, right? Being like, hey, look at this. Ones that you trust and that are going to be honest with you, to be like, do they sound different?
Exactly. Yeah. And I do think the biggest thing is being kind to yourself and really seeing writing and creating as a practice, because it really is a practice. It's not just that you are going to get it on the first go. And it's not that you're going to suddenly a light will go on and everything will become easy. You really do have to work at it, and that's okay.
I think that's fantastic advice, because I think that's what we all think. Even after years and years of writing, it's like, one of these days the light's going to come on and it's going to be perfect. And it's not. It's always a process with every project. And I appreciate hearing that. I think hopefully our listeners will remember that. It's a long haul marathon process. Lifetime.
Exactly.
Especially with characters, because to me, having a character in my novel is like having a relationship with a person.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't build a relationship with a person in 5 minutes.
Right.
It takes you a long time to build a relationship with a person. And I think if you want your characters to be that real, then you're going to have to take the time with them and get to know.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think the other thing is, I often wonder if people are too quick to decide who the character is and then not allow for changes to happen later, right?
Yeah.
That they push against what they're learning about the character instead of embracing it. And I think if you do sort of take the notes and changes and things that come up while you're getting to know that person and then integrate, then it can make the project that much richer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good.
Wow. This has been great, Karen. This is really
wonderful.
Thank you so much for coming, joining us, and talking to us about character. It's something that I think we all want to do well, but probably struggle with unless we're gifted. But it's so fascinating. So thanks so much for talking with us about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I was so glad that this was the topic, because I think it's such a good one to dig into and really to remind yourself that you have to really work at it and figure out the best way to go with it.
Yeah. Every time we learn from you, I always walk away with tangible things and exercises I can apply to my work, as opposed to leaving being like, well, that was great. Now what? You know what I mean? And not that sometimes inspiration is all you need, right? But sometimes if you're like, okay, how do I apply this to my work? And I think that's one of the great things. And we so appreciate you sharing with everyone. Now we have things to do to help develop our characters, to make them authentic.
Homework.
Homework. All right, y'all. hit that plate.
Everybody
Up.
hit-
Burger, combo meal, extra.
That's awesome. I'm so glad to hear that because I definitely come from a place of the more workshop-y that things can be. I think that's how I always learn best is by doing and putting pen to paper and really thinking it through.
Absolutely.
And I think best out loud. And I just think that writing can be a really lonely thing, right? That you're sitting alone at home and you're with a paper and pen or the computer screen. And the more you can interact with either yourself or others or your own characters, the better, right?
I love that.
Absolutely.
I'm ready to go interact with some characters now. So awesome.
All right. Please join us next week as we dive into more topics about writing and publishing. We'll see you next time.